We'll begin with the tide of toxic algae many worry will swamp the Treasure Coast waterways again this summer. Scientists say phosphorus from the fertilizer used in agricultural fields in the watershed north of Lake Okeechobee are a prime culprit here. That phosphorus pours from north to south into the Big Lake. An average of late of about 500 tons a year, 5 times what experts think the lake can handle without supercharging those algae blooms. My first guest, Republican local Congressman Brian Mast.
Bottom line is this: people should be worried. We just passed the beginning of May, not even into summer. You've seen the most toxic algal blooms ever measured in the history of Lake Okeechobee, over 100 times more toxic than what the EPA said humans should come in contact with. That is concerning. What can be done? That's the bottom line question. More water has to go to the Everglades. More water has to get out of the lake before we get into hurricane season and those heavy rains, as can be expected as we move into summertime. Certainly a lot of prayer that these algal blooms dissipate, which is not likely because the temperatures are only going up from here until September, October. So that's the worst conditions for those algal blooms. And we need the state of Florida to acknowledge that this is going to be a state of emergency. And I'd make one more quick point on this. EPA has acknowledged that this is toxic and poisonous. Corps of Engineers has acknowledged this toxic and poisonous. And de facto, the state of Florida has acknowledged this in this way. The South Florida Water Management District, before getting any reports of just how toxic that bloom was in the Pahokee Marina, has begun spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to clean that up because they knew before they ever got a test back just how toxic it was. They need to take that seriously.
What can federal policymakers do, though? Because people are upset with everybody, and they're saying, wait a minute, environmentalists tell me we've had plans for 40 years, and the federal-state partnerships are always saying the next plan's just around the corner. And they say one of the big answers is plans that need the dust taken off of them to clean phosphorus coming in from the watershed to the north into the lake. The phosphorus load is just too much. They say there's plans to address it, but it never is by state and federal policymakers.
Federal law is not going to put into place that there's a phosphorus load, maximum load going into Lake Okeechobee or coming out of Lake Okeechobee. I have tried to work with the EPA. It's the chief legislation I work on, saying no greater than 8 parts per billion microcystin, because that's literally toxic. We won't take that load. Number one piece of legislation. At the state level, state lawmakers, state senators, they can absolutely be writing legislation to say, no loads greater than 10 parts per billion phosphorus, like the Everglades enjoys right now. That could be put for the Kissimmee, for Lake Okeechobee, the Caloosahatchee, the St. Lucie. That could be put on those waterways. That's not been undertaken under this last legislative session. What we need from the federal level is certainly a bill to pass to the Corps of Engineers to say, hey, no discharges over this toxic level, 8 parts per billion microcystin. And beyond that, to say, if there's going to be a state of emergency there, they're going to use efforts from the Federal Stafford Act to go out there and support the cleanup efforts of this on Lake Okeechobee.
Congressman, we're almost certain to see, though, because none of that is necessarily in place, to see discharges, especially in rainy season, to the east and west. Given that eventuality, that concern that's going to have you meeting with a lot of concerned constituents this summer, are you able to line up extra help for affected residents and businesses ahead of the emergency, or are people going to have to wait till the emergency is very likely upon them before they can get help? Already hammered so badly by COVID, they're worried they're going to be hammered again. What can you do ahead of this crisis?
You took the words out of my mouth. Already hammered by COVID, businesses, restaurants on the water, you name. Here's my commitment to what I'm going to do. If the Corps of Engineers tells us that they're going to start discharging water into the St. Lucie, we are going to go out there. I'm going to drop my dinghy in the water, and I'm going to anchor it directly beneath that lock and dam so that they can't dump that water out. I swear to God, that's what I will be doing. Everything physically possible to stop them from poisoning our community. And people in other communities should consider doing that as well. If they're not going to do it by regulation or by law, then you have to take matters physically into your own hands and say, you've acknowledged this is poisonous, it's toxic, and you're not allowed to poison me. And that's the bottom line. And that's the point that I will take this to.
But it's symbolism, and it will have real value there. It's certainly got a lot of media coverage, you and your dinghy underneath.
It's not symbolism. It's literally stopping them.
Well, Can you though? Because the Army Corps, at the end of the day, they're the ones who make that decision. They've got to be worried about the dike. And I didn't mean to be facetious, but ultimately they say we've got to also be worried about the dike. So as a practical matter, can you really stop them long term? And what is your bottom line to folks about where we go?
Two important points on that. So one, you can physically stop them. They have barriers outside of those lock and dam structures that if people or vessels move inside of that, they can't empty those lock and dams because they would sink a vessel, the undertows, the things that go on in there, they can't do it. So yes, it would physically stop them from being able to move that water. That's why that's important. The other side of this is to simply say, listen, you're not going to dump the toxic water on us. And that's the bottom line. We will do everything physically to stop you.
Briefly, is it even legal to do what you're suggesting?
I think it should be illegal for them to dump toxic water on us. I don't know if it's legal for me to go out there and do that or not, but it's the most responsible thing that can be done. Again, to put it into perspective, the most toxic water ever measured on Lake Okeechobee, over 100 times more toxic than what the EPA said people should come in contact with. It's irresponsible to not do everything possible to stop them from dumping that on an epicenter of population. Let me give you one other quick point on this. You read all the releases on Piney Point, and in those releases on Piney Point, in every single one of them, they mentioned human health and human safety over and over and over again. This should be no different.